July 22, 1991, a handcuffed man named Tracy Edwards flagged down a Milwaukee police car at 11:30 p.m. When officers followed him back to apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments, they discovered what would become one of America's most notorious crime scenes. But this story doesn't begin in that apartment. It begins decades earlier, in a house filled with silence, chemicals, and a child no one seemed to notice was disappearing. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Joyce and Lionel Dahmer. From the beginning, the household was fractured. Joyce suffered from severe depression, anxiety, and what would now likely be diagnosed as a personality disorder. During her pregnancy with Jeffrey, she took a cocktail of medications, morphine, barbiturates, and other drugs prescribed for her constant complaints of illness. She experienced episodes of paranoia and rigid, obsessive behavior. She would lock herself in rooms for hours. She demanded constant attention from Lionel while simultaneously pushing him away. Lionel Dahmer was a chemistry graduate student, later a research chemist. He was intellectually brilliant but emotionally absent. His work became both his passion and his escape from Joyce's volatility. He would later describe their home as filled with an almost constant state of maternal bewilderment and paternal absence. Jeffrey, caught between them, became invisible. As an infant, he was described as unusually unresponsive. He didn't reach for his mother, didn't make eye contact, rarely smiled. At age 4, he underwent surgery for a double hernia. Family members recalled that the active, curious boy who went into surgery never quite came back. Whether this was trauma, coincidence, or simply when his innate neurology became more apparent, it marked a shift. Jeffrey became profoundly withdrawn. Here's where Lionel's influence became particularly significant, though unintentionally dark. When Jeffrey was around 6 years old, Lionel was clearing out the crawl space beneath their house. He found the bones of small animals, remains left by previous owners or natural deaths. Young Jeffrey watched, transfixed, as his father showed him the bones, explaining their structure. Lionel, hoping to connect with his remote son, demonstrated how to use bleach and chemicals to clean bones, making them pristine white. For Lionel, this was science. For Jeffrey, it became something else entirely. Jeffrey began collecting roadkill, dead squirrels, birds, even a dog he found. He would take them to a small shed behind the house, a place he called his laboratory. There, alone, he would dissect them, strip the flesh, preserve the bones. Lionel noticed but dismissed it as scientific curiosity. He even encouraged it, believing his son might become a biologist or chemist like himself. But Jeffrey wasn't interested in science. He was interested in possession. In control. In keeping things that couldn't leave. By junior high, Jeffrey's isolation was complete. He had no real friends. He began drinking heavily, sneaking his parents' liquor, hiding bottles, drinking before school. He was realizing he was gay in 1970s Ohio, a place and time where that realization brought only shame and fear. At home, Joyce and Lionel's marriage was disintegrating. They fought constantly. Screaming matches that lasted hours. Joyce threatened suicide multiple times. She would take handfuls of pills and lock herself in the bathroom. Young Jeffrey and his younger brother David learned to navigate around her episodes, never knowing which version of their mother they would encounter. Lionel, overwhelmed and ill-equipped to handle Joyce's mental illness, retreated further into his work. He later admitted he simply didn't know how to reach Jeffrey. He saw the drinking. He saw the isolation. But he didn't connect these warning signs into a coherent picture of a boy in crisis. Jeffrey later described this period as when his violent fantasies began. He would imagine having complete control over another person. Someone attractive, someone male, someone who could never reject him or leave. The fantasies were sexual but also about possession and permanence. He began jogging along roads, imagining what it would be like to attack a jogger he found attractive, to render them unconscious, to keep them. In interviews years later, Lionel Dahmer would wrestle with guilt, wondering if his teaching Jeffrey about bones, his emotional absence, or his failure to intervene with the drinking had created the monster his son became. The truth, more complex and disturbing, is that Jeffrey was likely already predisposed to psychopathy. But the environment, the chaos, the neglect, the enabling, provided no intervention, no redirection, no help. Jeffrey graduated high school in June 1978. His classmates voted him most likely to succeed. They didn't know him. They only knew his class clown persona, bizarre pranks and fake seizures that masked the hollow person inside. 3 weeks after graduation, his parents' divorce was finalized. Joyce moved out, taking Jeffrey's younger brother David with her. Lionel had already moved into a motel. Jeffrey, 18 years old, was left completely alone in the family home. On June 18, 1978, just 3 weeks into this solitude, Jeffrey picked up 19-year-old Stephen Hicks, who was hitchhiking to a rock concert. Dahmer invited him home to drink beer and listen to music. They got along well. When Hicks said he needed to leave, something in Jeffrey snapped. The thought of being alone again, of another person walking out, was unbearable. He grabbed a 10-pound dumbbell and struck Hicks across the back of the head, then strangled him with the barbell. This wasn't rage. It was panic masked as control. Dahmer dismembered the body in the crawlspace, using the same techniques his father had taught him for cleaning animal bones. He dissolved some flesh with acid, crushed the bones with a sledgehammer, and scattered them in the woods behind the house. He kept this secret for 13 years. After killing Hicks, Dahmer seemed to retreat from his darkest impulses, but only externally. He enrolled at Ohio State University but lasted only 1 semester, expelled for alcoholism. In 1979, his father forced him to enlist in the Army. Dahmer trained as a medical specialist in San Antonio, then was stationed in Germany. Even in the military, the drinking continued. Fellow soldiers later reported that Dahmer was strange but kept to himself. He was discharged in 1981 for habitual drunkenness, an honorable discharge that failed to document the severity of his problems. He moved in with his paternal grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, in West Allis, Wisconsin. She offered structure, love, and stability, perhaps the first he'd ever consistently received. For a few years, it seemed to help. But in 1982, he was arrested for exposing himself to children at a state fair. He received a probation sentence. In 1986, he was arrested again for masturbating in front of 2 12-year-old boys. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison but served only 10 months with work release. These arrests should have been definitive red flags. Instead, they were treated as isolated incidents of indecent exposure rather than escalating predatory behavior. During these years, his grandmother began noticing disturbing signs, strange smells from the basement, late-night noises, and once, a fully intact male torso she discovered in a box. When confronted, Jeffrey claimed it was something from his job. He worked briefly at a chocolate factory. She asked him to leave in 1988, though with reluctance and love. On September 15, 1987, Dahmer killed again. He met 25-year-old Stephen Twomey at a gay bar and brought him to the Ambassador Hotel. The next morning, Dahmer woke to find Twomey dead, his chest caved in, blood everywhere. Dahmer claimed he had no memory of the killing. He'd blacked out from drinking. But he remembered everything after. Buying a large suitcase, stuffing the body inside, taking a taxi back to his grandmother's basement, and dismembering Twomey there. This began the acceleration. Between 1988 and 1991, Dahmer murdered at least 15 more people, though he may have killed others he never disclosed. His victims followed a pattern. Most were young Black and Asian men, many from marginalized communities. Gay men, sex workers, runaways. He met them at gay bars, bathhouses, shopping malls, and bus stops. He offered money for photos or simply companionship. Once at his apartment, he drugged them with sleeping pills dissolved in drinks. When they lost consciousness, he strangled them. After death, Dahmer engaged in necrophilia. He photographed the bodies in various poses. He dismembered them methodically, using the skills learned in childhood. He kept skulls, spray-painted some gold, preserved them as mementos. He kept bones. He dissolved flesh in a 57-gallon drum of acid. He admitted to cannibalism, not out of hunger, but believing that consuming parts of his victims would make them part of him, ensuring they could never truly leave. Neighbors in the Oxford apartments complained repeatedly about horrific smells and strange sounds, dragging, sawing, late-night activity. Police were called multiple times. Dahmer explained away the stench as a broken freezer or spoiled meat. Officers never investigated further. One neighbor reported seeing Dahmer dragging what looked like a body down the hallway. Nothing was done. The system didn't just fail. It actively enabled. On May 27, 1991, 14-year-old Konorak Sinthasumphone became Dahmer's 13th victim, though not immediately. Konorak was the younger brother of the boy Dahmer had molested in 1988. Dahmer lured him to the apartment with the promise of money for photos. He drugged him and began his assault. But Konorak managed to escape while Dahmer was out buying beer. 3 black women, Sandra Smith, Tina Spivey, and Nicole Childress, found the boy naked, bleeding from the rectum, incoherent, and stumbling in the street. They called 911 and stayed with him. When Dahmer returned, he told the women Konorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend and they'd had an argument. Police arrived. Despite the women's insistence that this was a child in danger, despite Konorak's inability to communicate coherently, despite his visible injuries, officers accepted Dahmer's story. They ran his name. He was a registered sex offender with a prior conviction for molesting Konorak's older brother, though officers either didn't notice or didn't care. They escorted Konorak back to Dahmer's apartment. One officer later radioed that they'd returned the intoxicated Asian naked male to his sober boyfriend, and joked about needing to deloused after the call. They never checked Dahmer's apartment, where the body of another victim, Tony Hughes, was decomposing in the bedroom. Dahmer murdered Konorak within the hour. This wasn't just a failure of policing. It was a failure rooted in racism, homophobia, and the systemic devaluation of marginalized lives. Had Konorak been white, had the women who called for help been white, had the officers believed that a young Asian boy's life mattered, he would have survived. On July 22, 1991, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards met Dahmer at a Milwaukee shopping mall. Dahmer offered him money to come back to his apartment for photos. Edwards agreed. Once inside, Dahmer handcuffed him and held a knife to his throat, telling him he intended to eat his heart. Edwards fought back, punching Dahmer and escaping into the hallway, still handcuffed. He flagged down a police car. Officers Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller accompanied Edwards back to apartment 213. When Dahmer couldn't produce the key to the handcuffs, officers began searching. In a bedroom drawer, they found Polaroids, men in various states of dismemberment. Then they opened the refrigerator. Inside, a severed head. The apartment revealed the full scope of horror. More heads in the freezer, a 57-gallon drum filled with acid and decomposing bodies, boxes of bones, skulls, preserved hands and genitals, photographs documenting every stage of death and dismemberment. Dahmer offered no resistance. He simply said, "For what I did, I should be dead." When Jeffrey Dahmer arrived at Columbia Correctional Institution in 1992, he requested placement in general population. Prison officials were hesitant. His notoriety made him a target. But Dahmer insisted. He told psychologists he didn't care if he died. Some believed he wanted it. For the first year, Dahmer was kept in protective custody for his own safety. But in July 1994, he was transferred to a less restrictive unit where he had more contact with other inmates. It was a decision that would prove fatal. Dahmer's behavior in prison was deeply disturbing, even by prison standards. He showed little remorse for his crimes and seemed detached from the horror he'd caused. But more troubling was how he interacted with other inmates. According to multiple prisoner accounts, Dahmer would deliberately antagonize and unsettle those around him. He would use his food, ketchup, meat, prison-issued items, to fashion grotesque sculptures that resembled severed limbs and body parts. He arranged them on his plate in ways that mimicked his crimes, then positioned them where other inmates would see them during meals. He would add red-colored liquid to create the appearance of blood. Some inmates reported he would stare at them while eating these creations, a silent, calculated form of psychological torture. He seemed to enjoy the fear and disgust he provoked. Guards witnessed this behavior but largely did nothing to stop it. Some found it darkly amusing. Some treated Dahmer like a curiosity rather than a threat. To many inmates, this felt like a profound betrayal. The system protecting a monster, allowing him to continue victimizing people even from behind bars. One inmate was particularly disturbed by all of this, Christopher Scarver. Scarver was already serving a life sentence for murder. He was deeply religious, mentally ill with untreated schizophrenia, and believed he received divine messages. He read his Bible obsessively and saw himself as an instrument of God's justice. Scarver watched Dahmer's behavior with growing rage. He later said he was disgusted not just by Dahmer, but by the guards who seemed to give him preferential treatment, who laughed at his antics, who didn't take seriously the pain he continued to inflict. Scarver began carrying a newspaper clipping about Dahmer's crimes in his pocket. He would read it repeatedly, reminding himself of what Dahmer had done, the children, the drugging, the dismemberment, the cannibalism. To Scarver, Dahmer represented ultimate evil, and the prison's failure to isolate him or punish him further was a moral obscenity. Scarver later claimed that God spoke to him directly, telling him that Dahmer's execution had been delayed too long, that the state had failed, and that Scarver must act as heaven's hand. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer, Scarver, and another inmate named Jesse Anderson, a white man convicted of murdering his wife and blaming it on two black men, were assigned to clean the prison gymnasium bathroom together. They were left unsupervised. No guards were present. This was the moment Scarver had been waiting for. He confronted Dahmer near the locker room. Dahmer tried to move away, but he didn't fight back. He didn't scream for help. Scarver later said Dahmer seemed almost resigned, as if he'd been expecting this. Scarver picked up a 20-inch metal bar from the prison weight room. He struck Dahmer repeatedly in the head and face, crushing his skull with brutal efficiency. Dahmer collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. Scarver then turned to Jesse Anderson and beat him in the same manner. Both men were left unconscious on the bathroom floor. When guards finally discovered them, Dahmer was still breathing but unresponsive. He was rushed to a nearby hospital but died approximately 1 hour later from massive head trauma. He was 34 years old. Anderson died 2 days later from his injuries. Scarver was immediately apprehended. He showed no remorse. When questioned, he said simply, "God told me to do it." He was convicted of 2 additional counts of first-degree intentional homicide and received 2 more life sentences. He would later tell reporters that he believed Dahmer's death was divine justice, that the state had failed to execute a monster, so God used Scarver to correct that failure. Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 people whose names deserve to be remembered. Stephen Hicks, Stephen Twomey, James Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Conorak Synthesumphone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, Joseph Braidhoft. Most were black. Most were gay. Most came from communities already marginalized, already struggling, already invisible to systems meant to protect them. Dahmer's crimes were not the work of a sudden monster. They unfolded across 13 years, with clear warning signs at nearly every stage. He was arrested multiple times. Police entered his apartment and missed obvious evidence. A child was returned to him by officers who didn't care enough to look. Lionel Dahmer spent the rest of his life wrestling with guilt, writing a memoir titled, A Father's Story, trying to understand what he missed, what he enabled, whether love and presence could have changed anything. The answer is unknowable. What is knowable is that a child in crisis was left to spiral, and the bodies piled up as a result. Christopher Scarver, the man who killed Dahmer, remains in prison, serving multiple life sentences, still mentally ill, still convinced he was an agent of God's wrath. And the families of the victims are left with loss that no trial, no prison sentence, no death could ever repair. This is not just Jeffrey Dahmer's story. It is the story of every system that failed, every person who looked away, and every victim whose life mattered long before it was taken. Their names. Their lives. They are what should be remembered. This has been Broadcast History. If you would like to tune into more content like this, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.